I never thought something as simple as a tree in my front yard would turn into a full-blown battle with my Homeowners Association. But that's exactly what happened. And the story is far crazier than you might imagine. You see, when I first moved into this neighborhood, I was excited. It was quiet, clean, and the houses looked beautiful. Everyone talked about how the HOA kept everything orderly, making sure lawns were trimmed, fences were neat, and the neighborhood stayed picture perfect. At first, I thought that sounded great. Who wouldn't want to live in a place where things are well maintained? But then came the day I realized that their obsession with control could go too far. And it all started with a letter taped to my door demanding that I cut down my tree. I still remember standing there on my porch holding that letter in disbelief. Cut down my tree? The tree that had been standing tall long before I bought the house? The tree that gave my family shade on hot afternoons, where my kids hung their swing, where we took pictures every fall when the leaves turned gold? That tree was part of my home, part of my memories. But according to the HOA, it didn't fit their idea of uniform landscaping. They said the branches extended too far and that the tree itself was inconsistent with the neighborhood design. Their demand was simple: remove it or face fines. I felt a mix of anger and confusion. On one hand, I signed up for this HOA when I bought the house, so technically I agreed to their rules. But on the other hand, how could they ask me to cut down a tree that had been there for decades? It wasn't like I had planted something exotic or built an eyesore in my yard. It was just a tree. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the HOA didn't see coming. That tree wasn't just any ordinary tree. It was a protected species under state law. When I first found out, I couldn't help but smile. Protected species meant you couldn't just cut it down, not even if you owned the land it grew on. It was illegal to remove it without special permits, and in many cases, those permits were never granted at all. So here I was, caught between two powerful forces, the HOA demanding I cut the tree and the law protecting it. At first, I thought I was safe. I mean, how could the HOA argue against state law? But if you've ever dealt with a homeowners association, you know they don't back down easily. I called the HOA president and tried to explain. I told him politely that the tree was protected, that it couldn't be cut down, and that I had every right to keep it. His response shocked me. Instead of acknowledging the law, he brushed it off and told me that rules are rules. According to him, if I didn't comply, I'd start getting fined daily until the tree was gone. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a tree. It was about power, about who gets to decide what happens on my property. The fines started small, but they added up quickly. Every week I'd get another notice, another letter, another threat. I began to feel like I was living under constant attack, all because of a tree that the law itself said I couldn't touch. Friends told me to lawyer up, but the thought of going to court against my own HOA felt exhausting. At the same time, I wasn't about to let them bully me into breaking the law. The whole thing became a standoff, and the tension in the neighborhood was growing. Some neighbors quietly supported me, whispering that they thought the HOA had gone too far. But others sided with the association, saying rules were rules and I should just do what they said. As weeks went by, I felt more and more pressure, but I also knew something the HOA didn't seem to realize. The law wasn't just on my side, it was ironclad. Not only could I refuse to cut down the tree, but technically, the HOA was in violation by even demanding it. They were pushing me to commit something illegal. And if they kept pressing, they could actually get into serious trouble themselves. That thought gave me some relief, but I also knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. And then came the day of the inspection. I'll never forget the look on the inspector's face when he walked into my yard and saw the tree. He nodded, checked his notes, and confirmed what I had known all along. Protected species cannot be removed. He even said it was illegal to pressure me into cutting it down. I thought that would finally put an end to it. But when I delivered that official notice to the HOA, instead of apologizing, they doubled down. They claimed that even if I couldn't cut it down completely, I was still obligated to alter it, trim it beyond recognition, or face consequences. At that moment, I realized this was no longer just a disagreement. This was a battle over rights, over who really had control, me as the homeowner or the association that thought it owned me. And trust me, what happened next only escalated the drama to a level I never expected. The fight with the HOA didn't calm down after the inspector's visit. In fact, it got uglier. Instead of backing off, they started sending even harsher letters. The fines grew larger, and the threats became more intimidating. Every time I opened my mailbox, there was another notice demanding compliance. They even warned that if I didn't act, they could put a lien on my home. Imagine that, risking losing my house over a tree that the law said I couldn't remove. It felt surreal, like I was living in some twisted version of reality where common sense no longer applied. What made things worse was the way some of my neighbors started acting. A few of them avoided me completely, as if siding with me would get them in trouble too. Others openly complained, saying my tree was ruining the look of the neighborhood. One guy even muttered that I was dragging everyone's property values down because I refused to play by the rules. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about property values. It was about control, and I wasn't about to bow down. Still, I couldn't deny the stress was getting to me. My wife tried to reassure me, telling me we were on the right side of the law, but even she admitted she was worried. What if the HOA actually tried to take us to court? What if the legal fees drained us dry? We had worked so hard for this house, and now it felt like we were fighting to keep it over something so ridiculous. But then something happened that gave me a new kind of hope. A friend of mine who worked in environmental law came by one evening. After hearing the whole story, he told me something that changed everything. Not only was the tree protected, but the HOA could actually face legal penalties for harassing me to cut it down. He explained that by continuing to pressure me, they weren't just wrong, they were potentially committing a serious violation. That flipped the situation completely. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I suddenly had leverage, armed with this new information. I drafted a letter with my friend's help. It wasn't an angry rant, it was professional, firm, and backed up with citations from the law itself. I attached the official inspection report and made it clear. If the HOA continued harassing me, I'd have no choice but to take the matter to the state environmental agency, and from there, things could get very messy for them. Sending that letter felt empowering. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just surviving their attacks. But of course, the HOA didn't just roll over. A few days later, the president knocked on my door. He wasn't friendly, and he wasn't smiling. He told me flat out that I was setting a bad example for the community. He said rules existed for a reason, and if I got away with this, others would think they could ignore the rules too. His words were dripping with frustration, but beneath it, I could sense fear. They weren't used to people standing up to them, and definitely not used to losing. The real turning point came when word of the dispute spread beyond the neighborhood. Somehow, local news got wind of it. A reporter reached out to me, curious about why an HOA was demanding the removal of a legally protected tree. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want more attention. But then I realized that maybe exposure was exactly what I needed. If the HOA wanted to fight me in the shadows, fine. But once the public saw what they were doing, the pressure would be on them, not me. So I agreed to talk. The reporter came by, filmed the tree, interviewed me, and asked about the letters. A week later, the story aired, and suddenly everything changed. Neighbors who had ignored me before now stopped me on the street to say they hadn't realized what was happening. Some even admitted they were disgusted with how the HOA had handled things. A few board members who had been quiet suddenly wanted to distance themselves from the president's decision. For the first time, I felt the tide turning. But just when I thought things might finally settle. The HOA tried one last desperate move. They scheduled a community meeting and announced they would be reviewing the case. Everyone in the neighborhood was invited, and I knew what that meant. They wanted to put me on the spot, to humiliate me in front of everyone and force me to back down. My wife told me not to go, to just let the lawyers handle it. But I knew if I didn't show up, they'd twist the story to their advantage. So I went. The room was packed, every chair filled, neighbors whispering, the board sitting up front with smug looks on their faces. The president started off with a long speech about order, about how rules kept the neighborhood beautiful, about how one person couldn't be allowed to undermine the community. Then he turned to me and asked if I had anything to say. The silence in that room was heavy, all eyes on me, waiting to see what I'd do. And that's where everything came to a head, where the whole battle reached its most dramatic point. Because what I said next and how the crowd reacted was something the HOA never saw coming. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. My palms were damp, but I reminded myself of what I had learned, of the truth that had been on my side all along. I began calmly, thanking everyone for being there. And then I pointed out the obvious. The tree was not just any tree. It was a protected species, something the state itself recognized as valuable and worthy of preservation. I told them that the law was crystal clear and that I had official documentation proving that removing the tree was illegal. There were murmurs in the room, whispers rippling through the crowd. I saw neighbors leaning toward each other, surprised. Then I told them about the inspector's visit, about how the state had confirmed the tree's protection. I didn't yell, I didn't get angry, I simply laid out the facts. And then I turned the tables. I explained that the HOA, by pressuring me to cut it down, wasn't just mistaken. They were actually in violation of environmental law themselves. That got everyone's attention. The board president tried to cut me off, his face flushed red with anger. He said I was twisting things, that I was playing a game. But I held up the inspection report for everyone to see. I watched as neighbors leaned forward, trying to read it, trying to confirm with their own eyes. That was the moment I knew the tide had shifted. It was no longer me against the HOA. It was the truth against their lies. One neighbor stood up and asked the president directly, "Did you know the tree was protected when you sent those letters?" He tried to dodge the question, but the silence in the room demanded an answer. Another neighbor chimed in, saying they didn't want the neighborhood's reputation dragged through the mud because of bad leadership. The energy shifted completely. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't standing alone. The crowd was with me. The president finally snapped, insisting that rules were rules and that exceptions would lead to chaos. But his words rang hollow. People were shaking their heads, whispering about how unreasonable this had become. The very thing he feared, losing control, was happening right in front of him. His authority was crumbling, and then something unexpected happened. A board member, one who had stayed quiet until now, spoke up. She admitted she had voted against the fines, that she had warned the president about pushing too hard, but had been ignored. Her words hit harder than anything I could have said. Suddenly, it wasn't just me accusing the board, it was one of their own. The room erupted in chatter, voices overlapping, people demanding accountability. In that chaos, I realized the battle was already won. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to fight anymore. The truth had spoken louder than anything. I sat down, my wife squeezing my hand, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The board scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. The meeting ended in confusion, with promises to review the matter further. But everyone in that room knew the HOA had overstepped. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. No more letters, no more threats. Eventually, the HOA sent out a notice saying the matter had been resolved and that no further action would be taken. They didn't apologize, of course, they never would, but the silence itself was a victory. And the best part? The tree still stood tall in my yard, untouched, its branches stretching wide like a symbol of resilience. Looking back, I realized it wasn't just about the tree. It was about standing up when you're being pushed around, about refusing to let fear and intimidation win. It was about protecting something bigger than myself, a piece of nature that had value, history, and meaning. The HOA had wanted to make me feel powerless, but in the end, their own arrogance had exposed them. Sometimes the battles we never expect to fight end up teaching us the most. I had learned the power of patience, of persistence, and of speaking the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And every time I step into my yard and look at that tree, I feel a sense of pride. Not just because it's still there, but because I know I did the right thing. So, if you ever find yourself in a similar fight, whether it's against unfair rules, against people who abuse their power, or against a system that seems too big to challenge, remember this: the truth matters. It might take time, it might take courage, but in the end, standing your ground is worth it. And sometimes, just sometimes, the thing they try hardest to take away from you becomes the thing that makes you stronger than ever. That tree will keep growing for years to come, long after this dispute is forgotten. And maybe, in its own way, it's a reminder to everyone who passes by. You can't always control nature, and you can't always control people. Sometimes you just have to let them stand tall.